Hello and welcome to Pesticide-Free Public Parks. I'm here with Peg Shaw from Toxic Free Philly. I'm Bobby Safransky, the Events Director at Clean Air Council, and I'm excited to welcome you to one of many events in the 2020 virtual Greenfest Philly presented by Toyota Hybrids. If you're not familiar with Greenfest Philly, it's the area's largest environmental festival, celebrating all things sustainable for the past 15 years. This year, the event is entirely virtual with live interactive programming scheduled from September 12th all the way through this Sunday, September 27th. You can see the full list of events at cleanair.org/greenfest. Clean Air Council is a member-supported organization working to protect everyone's right to a healthy environment. Our over 8,000 members bring their passion in the fight for better environmental health protections and are key to our ongoing work to protect public health and ecosystems. That means we need you with us, taking actions on alerts we send out, giving us feedback on our programs, and spreading our work through social media. Finally, please consider making a donation. I'll post a link in the chat for anyone that wants to sign up and become a member or to learn more about our work. Before I kick things over to Peg to teach us about pesticide-free parks, I want to encourage you all to put your questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out on the questions, but Peg will answer them at the very end. Okay, I'll stop talking. Peg, please take it away.
If it's okay with everybody, I am going to just start sharing my screen now and just jump into the presentation. So give me a moment to do that. Can you see?
I can. It's working perfectly.
All right. Okay, so thanks again for joining us today. So we titled this webinar, Pesticide-Free Public Parks, One Solution for Two Issues. Environmental justice in the climate crisis. And I think it's very important that we really contextualize the work that we're doing. And I feel like every time I work on this PowerPoint presentation, I'm constantly updating it with new things that I learn. It's an important process, I think. So thank you again to the Philadelphia Clean Air Council. Off we go. So here we are, Toxic Free Philly. We have our little logo, and we're calling on organic land management without toxic pesticides. I wanted to tell you a little bit about our story. We've only been together since June 2019. We're an all-volunteer effort currently, we've got started with a small group of women through our shared love of our public parks and our concern for pesticides as a land management strategy in our public parks. So we are, physicians, we're land managers, we're environmental policy advocates and specialists, doctors, and folks who have led Friends Park initiatives, PA Master Naturalist. There's a whole conglomeration of us, but we all have our own personal experiences with pesticides. For myself, as a public land manager, I've worked with pesticides as part of my job and have personally experienced the physical impacts of them, both with headaches and nausea and skin sensitivity, but I've also witnessed an enormous amount of accidents in the field with the use of pesticides, and it's really has been like the main reason that got me involved with looking into this issue a lot more and realizing that there's something we can do about that here in Philadelphia. So in our short 15 months of existence, we've just had our first piece of legislation introduced to City Council by Council Member Cindy Bass, and that was on September 10th, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that later in the presentation. We've also assembled resources and experts to initiate an organic pilot project. It's going to be in two parks here in Philadelphia. One is Fernhill Park and the other is Vernon Park, both in Germantown. We've become active members of our schools coalition, and that's been a really important part of our work. And you'll see in the presentation later how it's been a very transformative relationship where we've learned a lot about what's happening with the toxic conditions within our schools and how actually pesticides and pests actually play a big role with that. So we feel fortunate to be working with that coalition. We've been doing all sorts of public testimonies with the school board, with the city budget hearings. We've been promoting full funding for PPR operations and maintenance, which is chronically underfunded. And also we've been invited to participate in Councilmember Gilmore Richardson's environmental sub-advisory committees. And that's been a really great, also transformative experience for us. So we're growing a coalition of organizational supporters as well as individual folks who've been signing our petitions. So that's been our story, and we are super happy to be here. And let's jump into what we're talking about. So I wanted to frame the discussion today like with the biggest frame possible, which is looking at the global historical challenges that we're now facing and keep that framework as we move forward in this discussion between the climate crisis, the systemic racism that's now out for everyone to reckon with, and the pandemic. We're in some historic times, and it gives us a lot of opportunities. One opportunity that I took was I completed the Climate Reality Leadership Training this past July, which had 10,000 members. It was virtual, and there were 10,000 people in the training all over the planet. In one of the sessions I sat in, Sharon Burrow, who's the General Secretary for the International Trade Union Confederacy, made a really great point that I wanted to share with you here, which is specifically that the converging crises that we are facing are actually have the same agenda and the same solutions. And again, like this is a framework that I think is important for all of us that are doing environmental work specifically to have at the forefront of how we understand our work and how to improve it and move forward. So a lot of people are already familiar with the principles of environmental justice, but quite frankly, it's really been only in the past year since I've been doing this work with Toxic Free Philly that I've done a much deeper dive into those principles and understanding how they could apply and should apply to our work. So here I was looking for a good graphic that I didn't have time to make. And so this was a decent one. I thought that pulled out 5 of those principles that I think apply to our work here, looking at pesticides. Specifically, you know, shifting the burden of proof to polluters is very important when you look at pesticides. Redressing inequities, eliminating the intent standard. There's so many different things about this document that was created in '91 that I think is guides our work and will continue to guide our work with Toxic Free Philly. So we just need to recognize that racism kills. There are some real serious health impacts on people because of racism. And when you look at chronic conditions that those health impacts cause and you marry that with COVID, you have an enormous, I think I heard today was 12% increase or over 12% more people of color that are dying from COVID than are represented in the population. So there's a whole combination of these factors that we are beginning to understand much more concretely as it applies to work around environmental pollution. Additionally, it's the cumulative impacts of environmental pollution, especially when you couple it with environmental racism, where these pollutants can inhabit our bodies and really make us sick and die. Between air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, pesticides just being one of a litany of environmental toxins that we're exposed to that over time can trigger some of those health problems that we were just reviewing. So with regard to pesticides, we want to really talk about who's most at risk with pesticides. And of course, it's really the people that are using the pesticides as a matter of course, they are occupationally exposed to the hazards of pesticides. So in this country where we use so much pesticides in our agricultural work, farm workers are the #1 segment of our population that's really most exposed to pesticides. But there's also landscape workers, which applies more to our situation here in Philadelphia. And then children, pregnant women, and anybody that has a compromised immune system, neurologic system, endocrine, and respiratory system. And also, we can't forget our pets. There's more evidence coming forth now that cancer in pets are being directly linked to pets' exposure to pesticides in the landscape. When we talk about the risk to children, the National Research Council came out just recently and stated that, you know, the amount of toxic chemicals that we have in the environment are directly contributing to the rise of physical and mental disorders found in children. So we're looking at asthma, cancers, birth and developmental defects. And so that is a really important thing, again, when we're talking about pesticides in our landscapes and on our public grounds here in Philadelphia. Now, the 30 most commonly used pesticides, we do know that there are both health and environmental hazards. We know 1 at least is a proven carcinogen, 12 are probable carcinogens. We know that they have caused birth defects, reproductive issues, liver or kidney damage, they disrupt our endocrine system, and they cause neurotoxicity. And on an environmental level, they lead to water pollution, they're toxic to birds, fish, and aquatic systems, bees and other pollinators. And when they're applied to our landscapes, they destroy our soil ecology. And we'll be talking about the importance of soil and the soil ecology later. And believe it or not, if you haven't heard this, we even have glyphosate in our processed foods like Cheerios. So glyphosate is the main active ingredient in Roundup. You may already know that, but I don't know if you know that it's actually in Cheerios. And we're feeding Cheerios often to our little children on a regular basis. So this is a profound issue facing our planet. And here in Philadelphia, Toxic Free Philly is trying to do what we can to address it here. So one thing we just want to keep in mind also, keeping the big picture, is that toxic pesticides and fertilizers are derivatives of fossil fuels. So everything from extraction to transportation to processing here in Philadelphia to applying them in our landscape in the city. This is a network that's all linked. So pesticides are not, you know, there's something that we just have to keep in mind, the origins and how they keep us linked to the fossil fuel economy. So you think the Environmental Protection Agency might protect us, but just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. So some of you may already be aware that with the Environmental Protection Agency, when they're licensing pesticides, they don't rely on independent testing. They rely on testing by the manufacturers. Only the active ingredients in pesticides are actually looked at, and usually pesticides are a combination of active and quote-unquote inactive ingredients, and oftentimes the inactive ingredients are just as toxic as the active ingredients. So they ignore chemical combinations. Oftentimes pesticides are used in combination together in the field, and they can exacerbate their toxicity in that way. The tests to only look at short-term exposure and usually limited single application exposure. So they'll just look at like the impact of pesticides on the eyes versus the skin versus liver or kidney. They're only looking at single species, and really they're looking at estimating the toxicity of pesticides versus the profits. And that is what goes into how these chemicals are licensed and come into our world and in our bodies. In terms of regulations, so at the federal level, the EPA regulates pesticides. And at the state level, the PA Department of Agriculture is the department that's regulating pesticides. But in Pennsylvania, most pesticide regulation is really done through the applicator process. So to apply pesticides professionally, you have to pass an exam and get an applicator's license. And once you are an applicator, you have to maintain that license, and you are required to maintain records of pesticide applications for just 3 years. But you're not required to turn those into anyone. So the only time anybody knows what's been sprayed in terms of our governmental regulations is if there's a violation that's reported and that triggers an investigation by the Department of Agriculture. And at the city level, from what we've been able to discover so far, we still have some right to know requests we're waiting for the results of. The city doesn't keep any records at all of where, what, and how much is being applied in a city public lands. So there's this notion called the precautionary principle that generally is much more applied or readily applied internationally than it is here. But it's a basic principle that says if there's a likelihood of harm, then the precautionary principle says do not use it. And it really places the responsibility on the manufacturer or the user to prove that there will be no harm done by the use of a chemical rather than the other way around. So really it's based on safety first. And this is something that what we're proposing here in Philadelphia is a grounding principle for that work. In Pennsylvania, most people maybe on this webinar are already aware that we have an environmental rights amendment. Again, like this is the framing of what we're talking about. And there's only a small handful of states in the country that have this. And although it has been watered down since 1971 when it was introduced, I think it's a really very important thing that we continue to revisit and embrace and bring to the foreground of our work in our communication with each other and also with our elected officials and policymakers. So we did do a right to know request in 2019. This looks scary, I know, and it kind of is. And we asked and received from the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department what pesticides that they currently are using. So they gave us a list of 28 pesticides. And then we took those are mostly the brand name that they gave us. We then looked at what the active ingredients are with those pesticides. And then we matched those active ingredients to the documented health and environmental impacts that are listed on the website that's organized by Beyond Pesticides. This is a website I would encourage anybody who's interested in this issue to go to this website. This is like the mothership of information in many ways. And we rely on the work that they do quite a bit and are quite thankful for all the work that they do. So on that website, they have a gateway tool where you can look up an active ingredient of a pesticide and then see to what extent it's been documented in terms of its health and environmental impacts. So the categories that they use at the Beyond Pesticide site include cancer, endocrine disruption, reproductive effects, neurotoxicity, kidney, liver damage, if it's a sensitizer or an irritant, birth or developmental impacts, if it's detected in groundwater, potentially leaching pollutants, toxic to birds, fish, or aquatic organisms, or toxic to bees and other pollinators. So of the list of pesticides that PPR shared with us, you can see that none of them are really anything that we want to have on our landscapes. They can be very toxic to people who are exposed to them, and we've already reviewed who are the people that are most where exposure to toxic pesticides are most hazardous. And they're also quite hazardous to our environment and our water quality and pollinators that we rely on. Now, in terms of schools, we've learned a lot. This is something that we really kind of came to our attention through our work with our Cities, Our Schools Coalition. But in Pennsylvania in 2002, a bill was passed that requires all Pennsylvania school systems to adopt an integrated pest management program as of 2003. And not only that, they were required to notify pesticides were going to be used, to let people know and give them information that that is going to happen. And that integrated pest management itself should be a part of Pennsylvania's academic standards. So the good folks over at Penn State Extension in the Philadelphia office actually just did the IPM manual for schools and updated it in December 2019. And the thing about integrated pest management is all based on prevention. So when it's implemented correctly, an IPM plan actually reduces pests effectively through prevention and not a reliance on pesticides, although pesticides are allowed technically in an IPM program. If it's implemented correctly, you shouldn't have to rely on pesticides at all. And this manual here, that this is the cover of that I have here, is available online. If you Google it, you can access all 188 pages of it and take a look at it. I think it's something that people can use in their own homes. A lot of really great information in there. And as you can see, one of the things that I like about the way that they approach IPM is that they really focus on the democratization of information and the empowerment of the students and the teachers and the staff in the systems to actually be involved with identifying pest problems and stopping it before it gets bad. However, we've got a nightmare on our hands in Philadelphia. Not only most people are aware of the toxic conditions caused by asbestos and lead in the water supplies, but asthma and pesticides combine in our school system to be deadly. Some of you might have remembered the death of Laportia Massey in 2013, who was a 12-year-old student who suffered from asthma and was having an asthma attack on a day where there was no nursing staff in school, and she died later that day. In response to that, the school district in 2014 created an asthma management program. And they say that's to identify, assess, control, and prevent asthma in schools with a two-pronged approach, appropriate clinical and environmental management. But in 2020, Philadelphia School District still does not have an IPM program that they've implemented. And the schools are overrun with rodents and cockroaches. And rodents and cockroaches are the two largest triggers for asthma attacks. So I won't share any of the other details on this slide, but so we're not promoting integrated pest management on our landscapes, but we do think that with the school district, they have an IPM manual that's already been created for them, and we really are advocating for them to implement that. Now, earlier this year, the Black Institute in Brooklyn put out a report called Poison Parks, where they are just calling out the use of pesticides in public parks in New York City as environmental racism. And we had an opportunity to have several conversations with those good folks up there. And we just know that this is a growing movement around the country, and we have to do something about it here in Philadelphia, and we can. But we are limited to what we can do. So in Pennsylvania, we have a preemption law, which is basically a law at the state level that prohibits municipal or county levels governments to create any kind of legislation that's more strict than what exists at a state level. So you can see that there's most states in the country actually have something like that. And Pennsylvania is one of them. However, it doesn't apply to public land. So that only applies to private land. So we are approaching this as a way of how can we get pesticides off and no longer applied to our public lands. And I just have this slide here because this one map is showing all the major parklands and green spaces we have in the city. And this is correlating recreation centers and children, the population of children. So I think, you know, combined, it kind of just shows that there's no way that children can escape pesticides if they're used on our public lands in the city. And so we shouldn't do it. And again, just to reemphasize, no one here in the city can tell you how much, what kind, or where pesticides have been applied to our public landscapes. You know, nationally, we're completely addicted to these chemicals, and we just don't need to do that. And here's an interesting graph we wanted to share with you that the U.S. Geological Survey did a 10-year study and published this. It was across 38 states in the country, looking at evidence of glyphosate and its main derivative, which is AMPA, in our environment. And as you can see, it's pretty much everywhere. They found it in our groundwater, outfalls, lakes and ponds, wetlands, in our soil, in our water, streams. It's in our precipitation, so it rains on us or it snows on us, and it's in our soils. The issue with AMPA, which I note here, is that it adds phosphorus to the water, which takes oxygen out of the water, which is decreasing water quality and impairing aquatic habitat. So yeah, but we've got some good news. So don't despair. We're moving ahead. We don't need them. We do not need toxic chemicals to manage our landscapes. So public parks, playing fields, and natural landscapes around the country are being managed using an organic approach. And when you incorporate organic land management into how you manage your landscapes and remove chemicals, the first thing you do is focus on soil health. You create a management program that's site-specific, that engages and empowers the public. You involve monitoring. You're looking at what's happening, what's working, and then you're implementing non-chemical management strategies. All of these things are well documented, have been successfully employed and deployed all over the country, and there's no reason why we can't do that here in Philadelphia. So looking at the difference between organic and chemical land management, first and foremost, organic land management is safe. So there's no hazards involved with it. It's holistic, it builds a soil ecology. Healthy soil captures carbon. Soil is one of the biggest carbon sinks that we have on the planet after the oceans. It also helps us deal with the impacts of climate change through infiltrating and handling stormwater, preventing erosion, developing resilient plant communities, particularly our tree canopy, protects our biodiversity. It's just, you know, it's all positives with organic land management, and with chemical land management, a lot of the problems that I've already reviewed, that there's a lot of hazards, even with the storage and disposal and use of it. The act of using the chemicals are problematic. It also creates a treadmill of dependency where once you're relying on chemicals as a way of managing pests in the landscape, that ends up being like you're popping a pill and it's your go-to solution to everything, and it actually worsens and destabilizes the environment even more. But luckily, organic land management is all about the soil. Talk a little bit about the magic of soil. Some of you may be familiar with the soil food web, but it's a lot more complicated than. It's interesting to note that what is being portrayed in this image here is all taking place at the uppermost horizons in the soil. It's the topmost parts of the soil, and then on top of the ground, which is often called the leaf litter area. And I thought this was a really interesting piece of information to kind of lodge in your mind, that There are more soil microorganisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on the planet. So most of us don't give soil a second thought. We just walk around on it or rake the leaves off of it, but it's actually the foundation of our survival here on the planet. And I think moving forward, it's going to certainly be something that I'm going to be looking into a lot more. There's more information I want to know about soil and how it functions and all the chemistry that happens there. Jay Feldman, who is the founder of Beyond Pesticides, recently communicated in an email to us that the transition to organic land management is an integrated or integral part of community efforts to carry out a climate action plan. So this is an important thing. We really recognize that organic land management is a tool that we can implement here in Philadelphia to help meet our climate goals. I'm not going to read all this text here, but I do think that's just an important message for us to kind of take in and motivate us for moving forward. Now, although organic land management is not a product-dependent process, it's really, based on ecological systems. There are last resort products, and again, Beyond Pesticides maintains a list of products that are compatible with organic landscape management. And again, that's a resource that exists for the city that we can access should we decide that in the course of our land management that we need to rely on a product for something. One great piece of news is that this is an international movement. There are 30 countries around the world that have restrictions on the use of pesticides. And Mexico, I believe, is the most recent country joining that list a few weeks ago, banning the use of glyphosate. So we are definitely on the train and we're moving in the right direction. And looking at the situation nationally, there's over 100 cities, counties, and states around the country that have prohibited the use of glyphosate and or all pesticides. And we have a big question mark here in Pennsylvania because we don't have anything on the books yet here. But we're hoping Philadelphia might be leading the way for the rest of the state soon. But we do have examples around the country of public landscapes that are managed without chemicals. So Battery Park in New York City is managed 100% through organic land management practices. San Francisco, since 2010, has basically, dropped the use of their chemical pesticides by 90%. And similarly with Chicago, there's no pesticides used on 90% of the public lands in Chicago. Here in Philadelphia, we're pushing for 100% through the use of organic land management, and we feel like we can get there. Philly is definitely next because we have our new Healthy Outdoor Public Spaces legislation that was just introduced to City Council on September 10th. It's amending the Philadelphia Health Code, and here are the 5 primary components to it. It's eliminating the use of toxic herbicides. It's instituting organic practices. It's instituting reporting requirements, which, as I reviewed earlier, there currently are no reporting requirements. It introduces penalties for non-compliance and also includes a private right of action. So Councilmember Cindy Bass has been championing this legislation, and we've been working with her and her staff very closely over the past, probably this year, I think, probably in January. So we started with that. And they've been instrumental in getting this legislation to the floor. Not only that, but there were 7 or 8 co-sponsors when the legislation was introduced. So we are very close to having success here. And our vision is that the knowledge and use of organic practices become the norm, not just with folks who are working on public landscapes, but really with all of us, with whatever little patch of ground that we might be occupying. So we're looking at legislation and we're making headways with that. We've also helped, and I mentioned this earlier, pull together resources to institute a organic park pilot project, and we're hoping the lessons from the pilot project will eventually then be used to roll out across the city, not only with our parks, but with all entities that are managing public lands in the city. And through that process, we'll all be learning, anybody who wants to become involved with the pilot projects or across the city, well, what organic land management practices and protocols really look like. And that's going to be developing community empowerment, leadership, civic engagement, and also increasing public transparency and communication and accountability between the people and those who we entrust to manage our public lands. And just to zoom back out, that we really see the role of organic land management as, you know, a component in building a green economy with the climate change upon us and what we just recently witnessed with the massive flooding in the neighborhood of Eastwick earlier this year. This is something that we have to keep pushing for in all of our work. And we really see the organic land management program is one way that the city could really build use it as a hub and build a whole wheel of the green economy connected to that. More on the pilot project, but really it's really looking at fundamental and sustained change in our land management. Philadelphia is really lucky to have an enormous network of friends groups, and through my own work here in the city, I know that volunteer labor to remove invasive plants and plant native trees and shrubs is almost limitless. And we believe that the organic land management program through the pilot project might be an opportunity for us to rethink how the friends groups are used and offer more concrete training and training to individuals who are interested in this and really use it as a career development in the green economy. So finally, we just want to invite you all to join us, to go to our website, toxicfreephilly.com, and join our coalition if you're a member of an organization, sign our petition, reach out to your council members and tell them that you're all excited about the healthy open public spaces legislation and you want them to support it, participate in the pilot program, and support our legislation. If you're a member of an organization or that has where this is like a good fits your niche, or if you've got particular perspective that you think would be helpful to hear with the legislation, contact us. So please join us, and thank you very much for joining me here today with this webinar, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and having a good conversation.
Thanks, Peg. That was great. We do have a couple questions that came up in the chat, so we can start there. But as we're going through this, anyone feel free to throw your questions in the chat. I will keep an eye and try to make sure that I don't miss anyone. First question was from Chris, asking, the Toxic Substances Control Act was amended with strong bipartisan support in 2016. Has the effect of this amendment been positive or negative?
I don't know. That's not anything I can speak on, but thank you for bringing that up, and we'll certainly look into it, and maybe that'll make its way into my presentation. If you have anything to share on that, please share it with us.
Well, as we're waiting for Chris to see if he has any more information on that, I can jump ahead. Amy had a question asking, the IPM was first developed by the pesticide industry, saying it's good to know that people who it's good to know as the people who implement it, as since it originally did allow use of toxic pesticides. So I guess more of a comment, but if you'd like to speak more about the IPM, that sounded like a really interesting resource.
You mean the IPM manual for the school district? Is that?
It seems that way.
Or IPM in general.
I think IPM
so
in general pest management,
like. Right. So it sounds really good, but over the years, it's really basically a backdoor way of, just deferring to toxic chemicals. So that's why, like, what we're working with in the city with our legislation is implementing an organic land management system, not an IPM system. But I brought up IPM because of the conditions in the schools are so deplorable. There's no pest management, and at least there is an IPM manual that's already created that's not being implemented. And it seems like that is something that we need to have the school district implement ASAP, and go from there. And I think with that manual, because it does allow for the use of chemicals, which is something that we as an organization wouldn't necessarily support at all. The Penn Extension manual places a huge emphasis on prevention and on, as I said earlier, really involving the people who are using those facilities, from the students to the staff, the teachers, and even parents, family members in the surrounding neighborhood to get involved with that. And for that reason, I think it's fantastic. And what I was saying earlier too, if it's implemented correctly, there'd be no need to use toxic chemicals to manage pests in the schools. But on our public lands, we are advocating no chemicals at all, organic land management strategies.
We have a question from Lisa saying, when I look at the water department's report, it seems like not that many chemicals are required to be reported. So how might I find out if, say, atrazine or glyphosate is in our tap water?
Right. I can send you a link, or maybe I can share it with you at Clean Air Council, and you could send it out. But there was a report that was done by EW. I can't remember the name of it.
So someone did just add to the chat, environmental working group.
Thank you. Right. Earlier this year, actually, that they actually did their own testing of our water in Philadelphia and came out with a whole bunch of pollutants in the water that are, either not included in the water department list, or is at much lower toxicity levels. And so the environmental working group is basically saying that the standards that the water department is following, while they're legal EPA standards, they haven't changed to match the new science that keeps unfolding about really the impacts of these toxins. And so while the water department's kind of patting themselves on the back for meeting the EPA standards, the standards need to be updated. So that's one source where I would recommend you go to find out more information on that.
We have another question from Chris, different Chris from before, asking, what is the best possible outcome of your presentation today?
Oh, well, that everybody here supports the ordinance and gets involved with this project as it unfolds. Really, if you do support the ordinance, or if you have any questions about it, please reach out to us. But it's important for our council members to hear from their constituents. So everybody has one council member that's designated to their district, plus I forget how many at-large council members. But really reach out to them and let them know that you're aware of this legislation, and either thank them for co-sponsoring or sponsoring it, or encouraging them to do that.
Well, I am all caught up on the questions.
Okay.
Let me know. I mean, if there's any more, I can. Peg, you'll give me that resource to email out to people, right? So we can certainly follow up with everyone that's here. I want to thank everyone for coming here. This has been such a great, interesting presentation, and I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. So again, thanks to Peg Shaw from Toxic Free Philly. It's always a pleasure. You can see this presentation and everything else on our Greenfest Philly website. And let's see. Oh, we just got a follow-up question to that. So we might as well jump into
Okay.
that. Asking, do you know when the public hearing about this bill, do you know when it's being called?
Yes, it's scheduled for October 13th, and I believe it starts at 9:30 in the morning. And it'll be via Zoom, of course.
Well, I'm sure if you sign up for Toxic Free Phillies, I'm assuming you have an email list. If you sign up for that, I'm sure you'll hear more about when the public hearing is.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, great. Well, thanks again. And I think with that, we'll call it. I really appreciate it again, and this was great.
Thank you. We're really
If
happy
you
to be
did happen
here.
to miss any part of this, it will be online. So feel free to rewatch it or send it to a friend. This is jam-packed with information. So thanks again. Okay. Bye, everyone.